Okay, folks, we're just about to begin, about to gavel. Get underway shortly. All right, here we go. And welcome back, everyone. Our ongoing study of Bill C-10. Just by way of quick announcement, if anyone encounters an issue with simultaneous interpretation, please flag it immediately to the chair. If you cannot listen to the conversation in the language of your choice, either English or French, please let us know by waving as soon as you can, so that way we can fix it as soon as we can. But keep in mind that we have to have interpretation in order to proceed. Speaking of which, we have everybody online with the exception of Mr. Reyes. Right now, we're having some technical difficulties with his connection, but we'll get to that a little bit later. We're working with IT at the moment. In the meantime, I want to welcome our guests today from the Canadian Association of Black Journalists. We have Nadia Stewart, journalist and executive director. From the Canadian Media Producers Association, we have Reynolds Maston, president and CEO. Aaron Haskett, president and executive producer for Lark Productions, and Damon D'Oliveira. I hope I pronounced it correctly. He's a partner with Conquering Lion Pictures Incorporated. And the third guest, Racial Equity Media Collective, Sharian Barsoum, co-founder, and Amar Walla, director and producer, also with the association. Just to our guests, we each give you 5 minutes to do your presentation. I'll let you hand it back and forth if you wish. But we're going to start with 5 minutes for Madam Nadia Stewart, Canadian Association of Black Journalists. Ms. Stewart, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sim. On January 28th, 2020, the Canadian Association of Black Journalists issued a call to action. Joining forces with Canadian journalists of color, we released a document outlining 7 steps this industry must take to improve.
Ms. Stewart, I apologize for interrupting. I forgot to remind everyone, if you're not using a headset that is directly to your mouth, like the normal headset, if you're only using the I forget what you call them, but I guess the typical Apple. You have an actual mic. We need to get you closer to the microphone, Ms. Stewart. And for others who are using the typical Apple headset, please lift your microphone closer to the mouth so that interpretation can hear you fully.
Okay.
Apologies for the interruption. Madam Stewart, please go again.
That's okay. Now, as we mentioned, then there has not been research on Canadian newsroom demographics since the mid-2000s. And this should serve as a testament to how much this industry has been held accountable when it comes to racial equity. The only statistics I can point to today are from a decade ago, and they're abysmal. Among news managers at media outlets in the Greater Toronto Area, researchers from Ryerson University found only 4.8% of media leaders identified as visible minorities. Racialized journalists were also underrepresented among columnists, photographers, hosts, and even experts. This is the same problem that's existed since the Canadian Association of Black Journalists, CABJ for short, was first founded in 1996. One of the organization's founding members, Hamlin Grange, says the sad fact is that though our skin color makes us highly visible among journalists, we are all but invisible in Canadian newsrooms. What was true then is still true today. After the calls to action were released last January, the response we received came largely from other journalists and independent digital startups, the kinds of forward-thinking media companies advancing the conversation around diversity, equity, and inclusion in media. But from establishment media, the CBC, Chorus Entertainment, CTV, and others, there was no response, not one. Nothing from the major players in print journalism either. In fact, we would not hear anything from the mainstream media until June 2020. That is when suddenly the industry woke up, unable to continue ignoring anti-Black racism in the wake of George Floyd's murder. Suddenly, our organization was engaged in conversations with media companies across the industry about what change really looks like. And in case you missed it, Black journalists have been speaking for decades, sharing the painful truths of what life has been like for them in this industry, the covert and overt racism, the mountain of microaggressions, the unacceptable use of the N-word in newsrooms by their own co-workers. Even though these stories have surfaced, even though our organization and others are speaking, there remains a deep, deep concern that unless more meaningful measures are taken, nothing will truly change. This is an industry with a long history of lip service, but little oversight to hold it accountable. What is desperately needed here is accountability, which brings us to our thoughts about Bill C-10. We note there is amended language calling for updated policies within the Broadcasting Act that ensures the system serves the needs and interests of all Canadians, including Canadians from racialized communities and Canadians of diverse ethno-cultural backgrounds. But our concern is this language won't actually change anything because the language does not explicitly protect Black content or Black content creators. Furthermore, it does not appear as though there are any clear consequences for broadcasters and media companies who do not create or make available programming to Black Canadians. We feel there is a need for more specificity. This is extremely important. How and why should Black Canadians trust a body, that's the CRTC, that does not truly reflect all of Canada, will hold accountable companies who fail to do the same? We are willing to engage with members of this committee and the CRTC to talk about what could be effective. Some examples for you. This might look like policies ensuring Black-owned media outlets are supported and protected in the midst of a changing industry. Additional financial contributions to the Canadian broadcasting system could also be used to support Black media entrepreneurs through new or existing programs. It could mean policies upheld by the CRTC, clearly incorporating criteria and consequences related to diversity in issuing and renewing licenses. Finally, it could mean a commitment to ensuring licensees have equitable representation in positions of leadership, a commitment that goes beyond gender parity to racial parity, something even this country's political parties have failed to achieve. According to Statistics Canada, this country's Black population has doubled in size from just over 500,000 in 1996 to nearly 1.2 million in 2016. It is high time that growth be truly reflected in Canadian media. The CABJ is doing its part in spite of the deep systemic barriers that still exist in this industry, in this country. Imagine what could be possible if those barriers were removed, replaced with an equitable, accessible system that did not limit the potential of Black journalists and content creators. Our hope is Bill C-10 is a step in that direction. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Stewart. Just a quick point of clarification, if I may. You mentioned the population doubled from 96 to 2016. Is that a national figure? Or?
Yeah, so this is data from Statistics Canada that they released in 2018, I believe. So the population doubled from just around 500 or so thousand in 1996 to nearly 1.2 million.
For the whole country?
That's right.
Oh, interesting. Okay, now we go to the Canadian Media Producers Association. We have three guests. Whichever one is starting, could you please just hold up your... there we go, Ms. Haskett. Please proceed for 5 minutes, please.
Hello, Mr. Chair and committee members. My name is Erin Haskett. I'm the chair of the Canadian Media Producers Association and president of Lark Productions. Lark is a Vancouver-based production company behind such shows as Fortunate Son, Family Law, and Motive. With me today is Damon D'Oliveira. Damon is the vice chair of the CMPA Board of Directors and co-founder of Conquering Lion Pictures, which produced the miniseries Book of Negroes. I'm also joined by Reynolds Maston, president and CEO of the CMPA. I want to thank you for inviting us to appear today to contribute to this committee study of Bill C-10, and to especially thank all members of the committee for the spirit of constructive collaboration that you've brought to the study of this bill. The CMPA supports the passage of Bill C-10, but we're here today to talk about two changes that should be made to ensure a strong and vibrant industry for Canadian content. One, empowering the CRTC to ensure fair deals between streaming services or broadcasters with independent producers through codes of practice. And two, ensuring that Canadians continue to own Canadian content. The CMPA represents hundreds of Canadian independent production companies engaged in the development, production, and distribution of English language content for the screen. Have a favorite Canadian TV show? Our members likely produced it. And we work on behalf of those members to ensure a bright future for Canada's media production sector.
That future will in no small part be determined by the fate of Bill C-10 and the tools it would confer on the CRTC to regulate foreign web giants. The internet has fundamentally transformed the way in which content reaches Canadian audiences, and streaming services have revolutionized the way in which film and TV content is shared. However, in the process, the control and benefits associated with that content, the content produced by our members, has shifted. Global streaming platforms are not just aggregating unprecedented catalogs of content, they're amassing enormous control, leverage, economic power, and cultural influence. drives the growth and success of the media production sector is intellectual property, or IP for short. IP is the ideas, the characters, the voices, and ultimately the stories that anchor film and television content. IP is also the leverage that producers have when negotiating with those who can connect the producer's content to audiences. For a producer, it takes significant vision, financial investment, and a time commitment, usually measured in years, to develop a concept into a viable piece of IP. This is a risk that producers willingly take on. It is our job.
But as the internet altered how audiences access content, streaming services have become some of the most influential corporations on the planet. And as buyers of our members' content, this is an advantage in negotiations. A quote unquote successful streaming deal for a producer today means this: they get a payment up front, they surrender global IP rights, and if they're lucky, they become an employee on their own show, while foregoing future revenues that would arise if the show becomes a hit or if it is replicated in other markets. The result is a vacuuming sound that is getting louder by the day, the sound of Canadian IP and the revenues it generates being sucked out of Canada by foreign web giants. So what is the solution? Codes of practice. Essentially, codes of practice, or as they are commonly referred to, terms of trade, are template structures for negotiations. You can think of codes of practice as agreed upon rules of the road, a set of baseline conditions under which future individual negotiations can take place in good faith. Codes of practice would enable Canada's independent producers to negotiate deals where they are able to hold on to at least some of the IP rights and in doing so, have the potential for a reliable source of revenue that can be used to invest in future projects, develop a slate of new Canadian shows, and ultimately build strong. To further underscore the importance of Canadian IP, we are also requesting that ownership of Canadian programs by Canadians be included as a policy objective of the Broadcasting Act. In closing, we applaud the government for the introduction of Bill C-10 and believe it is a key milestone for Canada's digital economy. I look forward to answering your questions along with my colleagues, two prominent independent producers who can provide real-world perspectives on these very important issues.
Okay, that was well coordinated, and you were exactly 5 minutes. I'm beginning to think you rehearsed this. Anyway, thank you very much for that. Ms. Barsoom and Mr. Walla, good to see you again. And of course, they are from the Racial Equity Media Collective. And I just need a show of hand. Who's going to start? Ms. Barsoom, go ahead, please.
Thank you, Mr. Sims, and thank you, members of the committee. My name is Shireen Barsoom, and I am a producer and board member of the Racial Equity Media Collective, also known as the RAMC. I'm sharing my time with fellow board member and producer Amar Walla. We are grateful to have been invited to speak to this committee. And
I'm sorry to do this, Ms. Barsoom.
Yes.
Yeah, that's it. Thank you very much.
Okay, no worries. We are grateful to have been invited to speak to this committee and to give voice to the needs and concerns of Black, Indigenous, and people of color creators with respect to the Broadcasting Act's proposed amendments. We present our recommendations today on behalf of more than 60 organizations in the screen and music sectors, including the Black Screen Office, Indigenous Screen Office, and the Alliance for Equity in the Music Industry.
The REMC is pleased with many of the proposed changes introduced in Bill C-10. In particular, that the Act names racialized communities in several instances, highlighting that our voices must be reflected in our broadcast landscape. We must point out, however, that while these words are welcomed, similar language has existed in the Broadcasting Act for over 30 years. The Act has included the clear objective of supporting, quote, the multicultural and multiracial nature of Canadian society, end quote. This language, while powerful, has been insufficient and led to little measurable change. The REMC believes that the current language in the new bill, while improved, must go further. If the bill's stated equity goals are to be successful, they must be measurable, monitored, and enforceable. Otherwise, history will repeat itself. We understand that this bill is tackling huge issues facing our industry, but anti-racism cannot take a backseat. It must remain a primary focus. the REMC offers the following 3 key recommendations that we believe move the Act and Governor and Council directives from aspirational to accountable.
First, we request the mandatory collection of race-based data by broadcasters and funders. Over the last year, the REMC has consulted with every major Canadian funder and broadcaster, asking who receives funding, who's commissioned, who owns the IP of productions. And the answer across the board has been, we don't know. Currently, there is no way of knowing for certain how bad the situation is or how much progress we're making. The only way to know is through the mandatory tracking of race-based data. The good news is that industry leaders like the Canada Media Fund and Telefilm have already recognized how urgent this need is and have started to lay the groundwork to collect and report race-based data. Now we need the entire ecosystem of our sector to do the same and to continue doing it long after the current industry leadership moves on.
Secondly, we ask that the bill clearly prioritize racialized communities in its programming objectives. To truly meet the bill's equity objectives, funders and broadcasters must be compelled to invest in content produced and owned by racialized creators. We are thrilled that Section 3.1 of the current proposed amendments prioritizes Indigenous programming and languages, as well as programming that is accessible to Canadians with disabilities. We would like to see this section amended so that it also prioritizes programming that reflects the lived experiences and cultures of racialized communities. The Governor and General Council directives to the CRTC should include directions that outline clear targets and incentives that are linked to a condition of license. The specific requirements of these benchmarks must be developed through meaningful consultation with BIPOC communities.
Finally, we are calling for equity oversight through the appointment of senior equity officers, both at the CRTC and at the Ministry of Heritage. The RAMC knows well the power of data, but we also know that data is only a tool. In order for that data to truly make a difference, we need senior officers who will ensure that the equity objectives of this bill are being met. They will ensure equitable representation within the industry's entire ecosystem. They will monitor and implement policy changes. They will make sure the community is properly consulted and that data is well interpreted and safely managed.
For years, our communities have felt underrepresented within the Canadian broadcast landscape. For decades, our stories and attempts to address the issue of systemic racism in the industry have been met with skepticism and outright denial. BIPOC creators continue to be underfunded, and BIPOC audiences continue to be undervalued. This is a chance for us to heal these wounds. Bill C-10 is a generational opportunity. We believe the measures we propose will provide lasting and meaningful change for BIPOC creators in Canada's music, TV, film, and digital sectors, and ensure we do not lose another generation of storytellers. More importantly, by investing in BIPOC creators, the landscape of Canadian media will flourish, enriched with content that equitably reflects this country. Thank you very much for your time.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone. That's great. Just want a quick reminder to our guests, if you're using, of course, the microphone on the cord, please hold it close to your mouth, as we've just witnessed. And Ms. Stewart, if I could get you to just get a little bit closer to your microphone, that would be great. We just had a few audio issues, nothing serious, but if you could get closer to the mic, that would be great. Now we go to our questions. And again, because we are all primarily in this virtual world, I would ask that my colleagues, the MPs, to please name the person you're directing your question at to help us along. Of course, we have, starting, we have Mr. Waugh from the Conservatives.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and welcome all 3 groups to Canadian Heritage here today. Racial equity media, you talked a lot about monitoring, and I have an issue with, I don't have an issue with monitoring. I just want to know who you think should monitor it, and how would that look? So I'm a little confused with that, and thank you. You gave us your 3 major suggestions here, but the CRTC, in my view, today seems to be overwhelmed, and now with your proposal to monitor racial based data, I would just like to know who your group would put forward as a recommendation to monitor this in broadcasting here in this country.
I'm happy to answer that. Thank you for your question. We really believe that the industry needs to be taxed with that monitoring. And so that needs to happen at the CRTC level, even if they are burdened with many, many, many other tasks. And we believe that to be so because, like we mentioned, for the last 30 years or so, equity has been part of the Broadcasting Act. It has been, the mandate of this country, but it hasn't happened. And so in order for us to be able to see some kind of progress and change, someone needs to monitor it. And it needs to happen at the highest levels of, of authority. And that needs to happen at the CRTC level and at the heritage level, which is why we're proposing the Office of Senior Equity Officers.
What would that look like?
It would look like, senior staff who sit at the highest levels of power, who are making sure that all the major funders, like Telefilm and like the Canada Media Fund, and like all of the broadcasters, are actually commissioning content, are broadcasting content, are exhibiting content, are hiring representatives from the BIPOC community within their ranks. And they would be tracking it using the race-based data that some of the organizations have already started to think about how they would start to implement that.
That's a big undertaking.
If I may jump in here, it is a huge undertaking, and frankly, the responsibility to create these roles and solve these problems cannot fall back on racialized communities, right? This is the problem that the industry has to solve. This is frankly a problem that the industry has been ignoring for far too long. And we've heard the stories about the CRTC and other organizations being overwhelmed for far too long, frankly. This cannot take a backseat to other priorities. And so, our industry, because so much of what we do is funded by the Canadian taxpayers, we do a tremendous amount of tracking on things already. We track where money is being spent. We ensure it's not being spent on foreign producers or foreign crew, for example. We do a tremendous amount of monitoring as is. This is definitely doable if the will to do this is really there. And it really is a problem that the community can consult on, but this is not a problem that the community can solve. The industry must figure out how to solve this issue. And we are very ready to work with them in order to make sure that the process goes well, in order to ensure that community consultation is a priority in solving those issues. And it's not going to be a one-time fix. This is going to be an organic process that takes many years, that frankly, we're going to screw up a little bit and have to fix those problems over time. So the most important thing is that we engage in that process and that everybody agrees that this is important and we're ready to begin that work.
Good, thank you. I'm going to move on to the Canadian Media Producers Association. I have heard from various groups in this country that intellectual property is the hill to die on. You invest so much money into your product, and then when it does get accepted by the internet giants, you have no say in it. That seems a little odd, but you did touch quite a bit in your proposal to us today on Canadian heritage. How may we correct this in the broadcast bill? Because you put the money out front, you do all the work behind the scenes, hoping someone's going to pick up your product, and when they do, they essentially become the owners of the product, and you're the employees. That seems a little far-fetched to me, and it is a concern in this bill. So, could one of you talk about that?
I'm going to turn it over to Damon to give a concrete example of what happens when a producer is able to meaningfully hold on to their IP. But just to speak to the specific solution that we're proposing first, what we would propose is an amendment to Bill C-10 that would empower the CRTC to require codes of practice between independent producers on the one hand and foreign streaming services and Canadian broadcasters on the other hand. We do not prescribe anything in this proposed amendment in terms of what those codes of practice would look like. We believe that's best worked out by the industry players themselves, but with the CRTC being the final authority to make sure that this actually happens. Damon, can you speak a bit about the power, essentially, of driving growth for your company, for the industry, when you're able to hold on to your IP?
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you for your question. I can speak to a recent production of mine, The Book of Negroes, which is based on a wonderful piece of IP, the novel written by Lawrence Hill, which my company was able to option in 2009. We proceeded to make it into a miniseries for television on the CBC. It went to air in 2015 as a six-part miniseries. Now, we retained control of that. We were able to sell American rights to BET, the Black Entertainment Television Network. And we made this as an international co-production with South African partners. And we controlled the IP along the way as the underlying holders of the rights to the book.
Thank you, Mr. D'Oliveira. I'm sorry, I have to cut it right there. We're past time for the individual question. You can probably work that in a bit later during the testimony. We now go to Madame Bessette pour 6 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
You have 6 minutes. Thank you. Thank you to all of our witnesses for being here with us. My first question is for our guests from the Canadian Media Producers Association. C10 wants to make the playing field fairer for content producers, for our independent producers. Might you talk to us a little bit about the reality for you and the difficulties encountered by the small producers you represent?
The typical negotiation, particularly that our smaller members encounter when they're negotiating with a streamer or a broadcaster, is they are increasingly expected to essentially hand over all the rights and associated revenues to that piece of IP that they've developed with Canadian creators. And in certain cases, they're even asked to make an organ donation. To quote a former head of the AQPM, Cal Samson, just to underscore the point. And what that essentially means is it reduces over time our entire sector into a purely service-based industry where essentially we're a branch plant of Hollywood, which of course is exactly why we have the Canadian Broadcasting Act and Canadian Cultural Policy to prevent that from taking place. And so not only do we need to ensure that we have rules that ensure reinvestment by the foreign streaming services into the Canadian industry, but we also have to make sure that that investment is fully leveraged so that producers are then able to hold on to some of their IP and the revenues that are associated with that and reinvest those revenues in developing new great Canadian shows with Canadian creators. And it's that virtuous cycle that we're trying to achieve through this proposed amendment of codes of practice. Aaron, could you speak a little bit to this as well, please, just in terms of the importance of having the ability to have those revenues to invest in future projects?
Sure. Thanks, Reynolds. Just with regards to this, I think, especially for the smaller companies or the startup companies that are just emerging into our industry, owning the IP is crucial to being able to build infrastructure, development slates, and invest in future projects and new talent. For us, we had a series early in the inception of our company called Motive, which was a CTV series that was internationally financed by NBC International and aired on ABC. Because of the regulation at the time, we had control of the IP. It allowed us, through distribution revenues, to reinvest in our slate and has, I think, put us in a really favorable position to be able to succeed in this premium content world, especially as the streamers are coming into Canada.
Thank you. Thank you. Ma prochaine question sera pour...
Thank you. My next question will be for our friends from the Racial Equity Media Collective. I applaud the important work you're doing to improve the situation of those who are underrepresented. Can you tell us about what types of programs and projects you're trying to promote?
I can start the answer, and Shireen, please feel free to add on. So the REMC came together as a group of working filmmakers and producers who, frankly, felt that the lip service we were getting from the industry around racial equity was not matching up with our lived experience as creators and not matching up with the lived experience of our communities. And so we really felt that the only way to bridge that disconnect was through the use of data in order to really get a sense of where we stand as an industry when it comes to the production of BIPOC-owned content and also the hiring and work labor of BIPOC crew members. And so a lot of our projects and a lot of our focus really is on using data to fill in these gaps, to identify where those gaps are and suggest policy changes, because we're really not in a position to make those changes ourselves, but really work with the industry in order to fill in those holes. So one of our first projects, for example, is really a roadmap on what the collection of data in the industry looks like right now. And I should say that, you know, currently data is collected. It's just collected in a, frankly, very haphazard and sloppy way. It's collected in a very often times dangerous way in that producers are often signing on as to whether their crew members and whether their hires are underrepresented or not. People are not self-identifying. So these are sort of major issues. And as creators, what happens is, you know, I, for example, as a director, I'm constantly self-identifying as a racialized person on every production I work on for broadcasters. I don't know where that data goes, and I don't know how it's used at the end of the year to really help me and help my community grow. So what we are, as I said, our primary objective right now is to really get a scope of data collection, figure out what the problems are, and then help the industry create a unified method of tracking race-based data when it comes to funding. Because, I mean, our position is really simple. As Canadians, we have just as much of a right to access this funding as any other community. And so unless we know which communities are truly falling behind, we can't create specific programs to support those specific communities.
Thank you. I have another quick question, if I can, Mr.
Very
Chair.
quickly, ma'am.
Selon vous, comment le gouvernement fait?
How can the federal government support your work and fight racism that still exists in our media industry?
Thank you. It's a great question. I think the best way to do it is to support the three asks that we've just asked for, which I believe the groundwork for these asks are already starting to take place in the amendments that are proposed in the bill. And that is the fact that the bill starts to recognize racialized communities, but we just needed to go further. And so the mandatory collection of race-based data will equip the entire industry to see what the problems are and to also monitor how much progress we're making. And so when we're back here again, hopefully not 30 years in the future, but when we're back here again, we can say with confidence, these are the very specific steps. And this is the progress that we've made as a nation.
Thank you, Ms. Bresson. Just as a reminder, don't forget about our microphones. Thank you. And now we go to Monsieur Champoux pour 6 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
You have 6 minutes. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses once again for being with us today. Our witness testimonies are always extremely important in helping us in our reflection on this bill. My first question is for Ms. Stewart from the Canadian Association of Black Journalists. Ms. Stewart, earlier you mentioned bullying experienced by some journalists in newsrooms, and that hit home for me because I worked in the media industry, in radio specifically. I might even have a bit more seniority than my colleague, Mr. Waugh. And something happened at the beginning of my career. It was very rare for us to have Black colleagues or even colleagues who had any type of different accent. And in radio, you can imagine this was discriminatory because the voice, there were certain standards in place for voice. I wanted to ask you if this type of event that you've seen have led to complaints, and if there was a mechanism that was triggered for those people who sent in the complaints, and how were the complaints processed, if they were processed, and do you have any, or were there any recommendations given to those workplaces I think it would be very important if that wasn't already done for it to be done. Can you talk to us about that?
Thanks so much for the question. What I would say is that this year and in the years past, we have heard Black journalists share the stories of what they have experienced in the newsroom. And within the context of our work at the CIPJ, we have been hearing from Black journalists whose stories were either buried or ignored, or even in some cases denied. So was there a mechanism by which they could file complaints? In some cases, yes. In some cases, no. But at the end of the day, the complaints didn't amount to change. Any concerns that they surfaced, based on what we are hearing from Black journalists, did not amount to the kind of change that they wanted to see, which was a decrease in the kinds of a decrease in the kinds of racism that they were encountering in their newsrooms or within the media companies that they work for. I will acknowledge that since June and the conversations that we have been having with media companies, we are starting to see the beginnings of change. But I would say that there is quite still a long way to go.
I'd like to continue on that note because I was wondering if you're just at the tip of the iceberg here. People who are victims of bullying or discrimination are, as you can imagine, uncomfortable complaining because they fear repercussions afterwards. Do you think in Bill C-10 there is a place for us to add in mechanisms that would ensure a follow-up for that type of complaint? Not just asking for the bill to guarantee proper representation, but for there to also be mechanisms in the bill for, if there were injustice that took place, that a process would be in place guaranteed by the bill to solve those problems.
I would say definitely we would welcome any kind of stronger language that would ensure that if something surfaces, if some incident of racism in the newsroom surfaces, that Black journalists have some kind of assurance that it would be dealt with in a way that's a lot more meaningful than it has been dealt with in the past.
Thank you very much. Now I have a question for the CNPA. We heard from the QPM, and your requests are very similar to theirs. More original content, original Canadian content, and more original French language content as well. More content, that means a need for more distribution space. Have you had a conversation with distributors about the broadcasters with the space that they could make for new content that would be created? What is their general reaction of traditional broadcasters when you say, we're going to be creating more, we're going to need more broadcasted? Have you had that conversation with broadcasters?
Question. We have conversations all the time with our broadcaster partners, both at the association level and at the producer level. We know that broadcasters are certainly coming before you in certain cases and talking about the need to reduce their regulatory obligations. We obviously have concerns about that, especially because their current obligations are actually quite flexible, even under the current system. So, for example, the major vehicle for contribution by broadcasters through CRTC regulation are expenditure requirements. And those expenditure requirements are determined as a percentage of their annual revenues. So when their revenues go down, for example, let's say as a result of COVID, then the amount of investment they make in the entire system correspondingly goes down. So we believe that provides a great deal of flexibility in the system already. And of course, they appear in front of the CRTC every few years to have their licenses renewed. And at that time, we and they put arguments evidence in front of the CRTC to determine what are the appropriate obligations for the next few years.
The
broadcasters already have those opportunities.
Thank you, Mr. Masson. I appreciate that. Madame McPherson, pour 6 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
You have 6 minutes.
Mr. Chair, and thank you to all of our witnesses for being here today and sharing this very important conversation with us as we look at Bill C-10. I wanted to just start, I think I'll start, if I may, with Ms. Stewart. And I wanted to dig in a little bit about why this is so important that we do address the failure to gather race-based data, why it's so important that these voices of BIPOC people are elevated and why this bill has an important role to play. I'm from Edmonton, Strathcona, one of the ridings in Edmonton that actually has been, has the very, very sad story of having many racial incidents over the past several months, many of them against Black Muslim women. Could you talk a little bit about what it would mean to have more Black journalists telling stories, have more of the content creators be from the BIPOC community, and how that helps in terms of combating some of the increase in racism and white supremacy that we are seeing in our communities, in Edmonton, Strathcona in particular?
Thanks for the question. I will just start by saying it is sometimes a bit frustrating to still have to justify the need for more racial equity in this industry. It is frustrating for us to still have to be talking about why newsrooms and this industry overall needs to be more representative of the country's population. At this point in 2021, if it isn't already obvious why we should be reflecting why this industry should be reflecting the population and even its audience, then I honestly I don't really know what to say. What I will say is that we encounter a lot of young journalists in the work that we do, a lot of young Black journalists, and our concern is that what they encounter as they enter the industry, or the barriers that they face that keep them from getting into the industry. Our concern is that they're just not going to want to enter journalism at all. And this, is a problem for us because we know that we need more Black journalists. It's one of the reasons why we started the CHPC Media Startup Bootcamp. We have a program where we train and equip Black journalists to launch their own digital media startups, because there are so many who are frustrated with the situation in the industry and have decided that they could best serve their community if they skip the newsroom altogether and built a platform to speak directly to this underserved audience.
We are seeing the fact that even just local media itself is not being able to have the voice, that we're losing our local media, and particularly when you look at a disadvantaged group of journalists that are already in that situation. I'm going to ask the Racial Equity Media Collective now a question. When Bill C-10 was being developed, there was very little consultation with the BIPOC community organizations in both music and film and TV. They weren't consulted in the research and the drafting of the bill. Can you talk a little bit about how and why community consultations are a key portion of moving forward on racial equity? And I'll pass that to Ms. Barsom.
Thank you so much for the question. That's actually a wonderful question, and we're really glad to be here, sitting here today at the table with you. We wish we could have been.
Ms. Barsom,
we wish we could have been at the table months and months ago. And the answer to your question is that without community consultation, decisions will be made that don't adequately reflect the needs and the priorities and the challenges of the communities that this bill and this committee is hoping to serve. So if you don't have those voices at the table, you just are not going to be able to meet them. And I would go further to say that the industry as a whole, I think we're going to believe in the goodwill of this government and the goodwill of this committee and the goodwill of folks who really have seen what's happened over the number of years and want to see change in this country. But unfortunately, goodwill isn't enough. Good intentions aren't enough. And the industry really does need to be compelled to make these changes, whether it's through benchmarks, whether it's through targets, whether it's through, incentives, whatever the mechanisms are. Just as we did, and we still have a ways to go with gender parity, we need to do the same thing when it comes to racial equity. And so, the community needs to continue to be consulted so that when the decisions are made to create these mechanisms and compulsions for change, that they're doing so with the right voices in their minds.
Mm-hmm. And I one last question for you, if you wouldn't mind. In terms of the recommendation that you have to have the equity oversight through senior staffing within both Heritage and the CRTC, why is it so important that there be someone at both Heritage and at the CRTC?
Well, not. I can start by kind of backing up a little bit. I mean, I think that, as Ms. Stewart pointed out, like the last year has looked very different in terms of the industry's approach to our communities. So something shifted after the George Floyd incident, and of course, we can all sort of wonder what that was. But there was a time before this where these needs and this type of consultation that we're after was really kind of ignored. So a lot of the shifts that you're seeing are only happening in the last year. With the CRTC specifically and with the Broadcast Act specifically, there are files outside of that would not be touched if the officer was just placed within CRTC. So we want to see changes across all of Heritage's files. So, institutions like Telefilm Canada, for example, may not actually connect with broadcasters because our feature film system is slightly different than our broadcast television system.
Thank you, Mr. Walla, and thank you, Ms. McPherson. Well, folks, we have time for round two. I only like to do that when I can include all four parties in that. So I'm going to be very strict on time, however. I don't mean to be rude. We're going to start with Mr. Shields from the Conservatives. 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Then quickly, Canadian Producers Association and with Bill 10, I may be the only one in my family that has cable anymore. My adult grandchildren don't. So when you talk about the advantage of global streaming services, as I discuss this with my children and my grandchildren, they have no idea what C10 is or what it could do. They just want to go find whatever it is they want to watch. So when you look at C10 and you talk about the advantage of global streaming services, how can this bill work to your advantage? Where do you see we're going with C10 to help do what you want to get done? So I'll start with Ms. Haskett.
Thank you for your question. I think this is a real opportunity for us, especially as we have new storytellers and new points of view coming to the table. I think we've essentially had a group of gatekeepers in this country that have only allowed a certain kind of story, and that has to serve a certain kind of audience. I think there's a lot of flexibility for us, and particularly with the independent production sector, it's really important that we strengthen that to be able to focus on diversity of regions, voices, size of company, kinds of producers, and the opportunities with Bill C10, especially with the recommendations we're making today around owning Canadian content and including codes of practice, would really strengthen our domestic industry as a whole.
How does that get to my children and grandchildren that they would find that? They're not watching CBC. They're not watching cable. They're going directly to global services to get what they want. I don't watch much on cable either anymore. I get mine off social media. I don't watch mainline news shows anymore. I get mine from social media. So how does C10 help get yours to the platform?
Well, I think especially for us as Canadian producers, and as it's proposed in Bill C10, if there's a requirement around Canadian content, we ultimately will have a voice on those streaming services, whatever streaming service it may be. I think there's a different kind of resource available to us with that. And ultimately, if you're looking at any of those particular streaming services, you'll be able to find Canadian content. I'm just going to, sorry. I was just going to throw to Reynolds or Damon if there's anything they wanted to add to that.
Very quickly, just one of the things we very much welcome in the bill is that there is an explicit focus on discoverability, and that would be part of the public proceeding that the CRTC would launch, in which obviously the streamers would participate, and we would as well, to determine what is the best way to ensure discoverability of Canadian content on streaming platforms.
Excellent comment, and I appreciate that. Because if there isn't a way to discover it, finding it, so how are you going to be able to challenge? Is this legislation strong enough to challenge the global services? I mean, look what Australia is dealing with at the moment. Can we, under C10, be strong enough to challenge the global services?
I believe the tide has shifted, and we are all watching very carefully what is happening in Australia. We applaud what the Australian government is doing. We welcome the fact that Minister Guilbeault has stated his support for Australia's stand. And we see this as a part of a global trend. You look at what's happening in the European Union, where they are bringing into effect equivalent requirements on these platforms to promote content, local content in the EU. So we have every confidence that this government, this country, can do something similar and be successful.
Is it in C10? Do you believe it's in C10 as a piece of legislation that can do that?
The key elements are all there. We've mentioned a couple of other elements that we would like to see in the bill, but there's no question that it represents a giant step forward from where we're at.
Of those things you mentioned, which is the most important if you had a choice to make of strengthening it out of the options you said?
The most important is codes of practice because that enables the producer to hold on to their IP. Damon, you held on to the IP in Book of Negroes, and what now has actually been the result of that?
Well, just to finish what I'd started earlier, we're now in development for a spin-off of the Book of Negroes with the CBC, which resulted in us maintaining ownership of the underlying IP. Had I done this with the digital streaming service, it might not have come to pass. And if I might, just a quick example of Michaela Cole, who is a brilliant Black British filmmaker, actress who did a show called I May Destroy You. She had an offer from a streaming platform for $1 million to sort of give all the rights over. They wouldn't even give her as much as 1% copyright ownership of that show. And she actually said no, and she took it to the BBC, where there is the codes of practice in place. And she was able to form a partnership with the BBC and HBO in the US and make that show and retain underlying copyright for her.
Thank you, Mr. D'Oliveira. At the risk of cutting you off again, sir, I apologize. That's no reflection on you or your work. It's just how you just happened to be at the wrong place at the right time, wrong time. Nevertheless, we have to move on. Mr. Housefather, 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm going to share time with the great Black journalist that we have on our team, Ms. Ian. So I will devote my questions to the CMPA. As somebody who used to practice as a general counsel, and I know how important intellectual property is, I think it would shock the consciousness of Canadians if they understood the type of deals that Netflix was actually asking Canadian creative forces to make, which is basically a buyout where you get paid a set amount of money up front. They may retain you for 2 years as an employee on the show, and then they can get rid of you no matter how successful the show is, and do it, entirely with a creative team outside of Canada. So I wanted to ask you, in terms of amendments to C10, in 2004, the United Kingdom created a terms of trade that gave independent producers control over secondary rights of their content. And I understand that it had both economic and creative benefits. Can you talk to what the UK's example was and what amendments we should make to C10 to reflect what the UK actually did?
Thank you very much for the question, Mr. Housefather. And in fact, our codes of practice language and amendment is inspired by what happened in the UK. You rightly note that codes of practice were first introduced in 2005. And within the span of 8 years, the capitalization of the UK independent production sector tripled. It went from approximately $1.3 billion to $3.1 billion in under a decade. And what it also did, because those companies were able to hold on to their IP and meaningfully invest in their shows, is it led to one of the golden ages of British content that we've all been talking about for years now. So you also see the benefit in terms of the quality and impact of the content that is ultimately produced, because those local companies have been able to hold on to the IP and meaningfully invest in the development and production of their shows.
Thank you very much. Marcy, over to you.
Anthony, thank you so much for sharing your time. I appreciate it. Ms. Stewart, I've got a couple of quick questions for you, if I might. 30-year career in broadcasting, and I was an only or one of a couple the whole time. I know that your members have stories to tell, and I want people to hear what it feels like, specifically after, post George Floyd, to be the only person in a newsroom having to share that story, report on that story, give perspective on that story, and highlight the need for more people of color, more Black journalists in this country and representing the newsrooms in it.
Yeah, thank you so much for the question, Ms. Ian. It is it's an isolating experience to be the only one in your newsroom, and it can be kind of a lonely and a difficult challenge whenever you surface the problems that you're going through, and you're either gaslit or just outright ignored. And so this is a big part of the reason why we're here today to speak about the changes that we want to see, because what we hear from the Black journalists that we encounter is that this has to stop. I will say that the only reason I believed I could do this work, I could be a journalist, is because growing up, I used to see Andrea Case on the news when I was growing up in Toronto. And so that is, for me, the power of one. It just takes one Black journalist in a newsroom to make a difference, so that other young journalists can see that they can do it too. That's the only reason I knew I could do it too. But we need more than one. It's only been one for too long. And it's been one in too many newsrooms across the country for no good reason. And so this is why we're fighting for change. This is why we're speaking. This is why we're advocating, because we know that better representation, yes, it's about the audience, it's about representation across the country. But really, if we don't start, or if these companies don't start better reflecting, Black journalists and Black youth across this country, then you're going to have a tough time inspiring them and getting them to get into your newsroom.
Mr. Chair, if I might ask one more question just quickly, and that would be the distinction you made, Ms. Stewart, between racial parity and gender parity, and why that is such an important distinction to make.
Yeah, very quickly. A lot of companies were quick to note that there has been progress in terms of equity around gender parity, but that has not worked out well for Black people, especially for Black women. In the end, gender parity just meant more white men and more white women. We still have not seen more women of color, especially from our perspective, more Black women. We're still not seeing them in leadership positions. We're still not seeing them on air and in the newsroom. So sure, if you want to celebrate gender parity, that's great, but we've got to get past that, because for us, gender parity has not meant that we're more visible.
Thank you, Ms. Stewart. Monsieur Champoux, pour 2 minutes.
Mr. Champoux, 2.5 minutes, please. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Earlier, my colleague spoke about people's habits watching television. Television has changed, and young people, when they turn on the TV, don't understand why they can't just switch to something else when they're in front of a television set. So consumer habits are changing, and digital broadcasters must be included in our rules and regulations in order to save our industry. So we're asking them to contribute. We want more money for our original Quebec and Canadian productions. We want more discoverability as well. My question is for the Media Association. So more discoverability and more production on digital platforms. Will that be a recipe for the success and survival of our industry? We want to see it flourish, not just survive, but be healthy and remain competitive, because the large American productions are going to continue to be available despite discoverability and the money to be invested. What are your views on this?
Giant step forward in that direction. To ensure that those players that are operating in our marketplace that are based outside of our borders and are accruing very significant benefits from the Canadian marketplace invest back in that marketplace. We know that they are seeking for these new rules that they be required to produce productions that they want productions that are less Canadian than they are today when the rules apply to them. And one of the things that we say in our conversations with our Hollywood streamer and studio friends is when it comes to investing back in our industry, we are asking you to partner with Canadian producers and Canadian creators for shows that are a little more Canadian rather than a less Canadian, which is what they are seeking through their advocacy efforts with you.
I just have a few seconds left to ask you if, in your view, it will be easy to negotiate and impose these regulations on the digital giants.
Not be easy, but I think that there's a recognition even amongst these players that the days where it was a free-for-all for them and they could behave as they please is no longer acceptable to Canadians.
Thank you very much. I hate to cut you off. Ms. McPherson, for 2.5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm actually going to go back to the Canadian Media Producers Association as well. One of the benefits, I guess, of going last is that I can ask you to follow up with whatever comments you feel haven't been raised so far. And I thought maybe I should start with Mr. D'Oliveira, just because he has been cut off a number of times. But coming from Alberta, we have a thriving industry that is suffering in terms of our creative content development. And I'm just wondering if he could start by talking a little bit about how the strengthening of these codes of practices, how the strengthening of the terms of trade will actually help Alberta organizations as they create content.
Well, what I would say is that as a racialized producer, primarily the content that I have made has been, specific to Black and queer communities. I feel that this is a great moment, and the CMPA strongly supports a fully inclusive broadcasting sector that reflects the diversity of Canada, and especially equity-seeking and sovereignty-seeking communities, including Indigenous peoples and Black and racialized peoples, people with disabilities, across a broad spectrum. And as far as this would reach across the country, this would reach to Alberta as well. I do feel that if we are able to control our content, to control our IP, what I have been able to do so far as a producer in Canada is I have taken the revenues that my company has earned and I have put that into additional content. So I am now working with a much broader spectrum of people. My development slate over the last 5 years since doing the Book of Negroes has grown considerably. And I feel that if that ability or the ability to control our underlying IP is taken away, that will reduce our capacity to do so. So if we get the support through Bill C-10 to retain control of our underlying work, we can generate a lot more content in this country and feed all of the growing domestic and international streaming platforms.
Thank you. Mr. Maston, anything else that you'd like to add to that?
Just very quickly, the two things that we haven't touched on. One is subsection 3.1f, which relates to Canadian talent and making sure that our Canadian broadcasting system makes maximum use of Canadian talent. We would ask the committee to perhaps revisit the proposed language there. There have been concerns expressed by our partners that represent Canadian talent that potentially this new wording, however inadvertently, could result in a dilution of maximizing Canadian talent as a priority. And so we would encourage you to revisit that. The final thing we would encourage you to consider is whether or not we should retain the right that currently exists under the Broadcasting Act for Canadians and stakeholders to appeal CRTC decisions to the federal cabinet. That mechanism provides some degree of additional oversight and accountability to the CRTC, even though the bar has always been very high.
Thank you, Mr. Masson.
An appeal to be successful, which is as it should be.
Thank you very much. Sorry about that, folks. We're going to have to suspend. Before I do, I want to thank the Canadian Association of Black Journalists, Canadian Media Producers Association, and the Racial Equity Media Collective for joining us on some wonderful testimony. We thank you so much. Folks, we're going to suspend for to set up our next witnesses. Thank you. Okay, welcome back, everyone. That was a nice quick transition now, wasn't it? As we make our way through testimony once again, of course, we are talking about Bill C-10, past second reading in the House and here at the Committee of Canadian Heritage. So we're into our second hour now. We currently are going to hear from Association de réalisateurs et réalisatrices du Québec, Gabrielle Pelletier, President, and Mylène Cyr, Executive Director. Please correct me when the microphone comes to you if I pronounce your name incorrectly. We also have from no stranger to this committee, Canada Media Fund. We have Valerie Creighton, who's the President and Chief Executive Officer, and Natalie Claremont, who's the Vice President, Programs and Business Development. And finally, Indigenous Screen Office, Jesse Wendt, who's the Executive Director. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. Now, we give you 5 minutes. I have a little bit of flexibility, but not a lot given the time. So we're going to start, of course, with Association Réalisateur as
The Quebec Filmmakers Association.
to start. Monsieur Gabriel, s'il vous plaît, pour 5 minutes.
Bonjour, monsieur.
Good morning, Mr. Chair and dear committee members. My name is Gabrielle Pelletier. I am president of the Quebec Filmmakers Association, or ARRQ. Today, I'm accompanied by our executive director, Mylène Cyr. The ARRQ is a professional association. It includes nearly 800 freelance filmmaker members working mainly in French in Quebec in the fields of film, television, and internet. The filmmakers assemble, coordinate, and direct the creation of audiovisual works on set and in the editing room. Mylène? Thank you, Gabrielle. Hello, ladies and gentlemen of the committee. I'm pleased to meet you. We support Bill C-10, which confirms that online broadcasting falls within the scope of the Broadcasting Act and specifies how the CRTC should regulate online businesses. That said, Bill C-10 needs to be improved to ensure that essential elements of the current Broadcasting Act are not overturned and that certain deficiencies are addressed. We would like to identify just two, given the time that we have today, that are particularly important to us. First, maintain the obligation to make predominant use of Canadian creative resources. Already, over the past 10 years, foreign and service production shot in Canada has increased from 30% of total production to 52%, while independent production of programs accredited as Canadian has decreased from 48 to 35% of total production. 78% of this foreign and service production was American and almost exclusively English language. We want to avoid any new version of the Broadcasting Act endorsing foreign and service production as an alternative to truly Canadian production. And that is why we want the Act to make predominantly Canadian creative resources the focus of the Act. In retaining the text of the current Act, the Commission could continue to modulate this requirement in its application to online undertakings according to the nature of each, as the wording of the Act already provides the CRTC with this possibility through the phrase, unless such a practice is impractical because of the nature of the service. Gabrielle? Secondly, it is necessary to reinforce the objectives concerning original French language content. If the text of the Broadcasting Act is not strengthened in this regard, major online players such as Netflix, Amazon Prime, and Disney Plus will be able to continue to present content dubbed or subtitled in French with little or no original French language content. 10 days ago, Netflix's co-CEO said his company had spent more than $2.5 billion in Canada since 2017. Of that amount, Netflix has produced only 1 film and 5 recorded concerts in French. Their combined budgets account for only about 0.3% of the $2.5 billion. Clearly, the production of original French language Canadian content is not a priority for Netflix, nor for other foreign companies whose track records are worse. In terms of the total supply of programming, it is not much better, as there are fewer than a dozen Canadian series or films shot in French available on Netflix. Obligations must therefore be imposed on these online companies so that Canadians can see original content in French. This is not a matter of imposing quotas in the Act, but rather of formulating appropriate objectives to ensure that original French language content represents a significant proportion of Canadian programming. Those are two of our recommendations, which overlap with those by the Coalition for the Diversity of Cultural Expressions, which we support and of which we are a founding member. The increased use by Canadians of online services, including social media, during the pandemic reminds us of the urgency to act to correct the inequities afflicting our broadcasting system. We therefore urge committee members and the government to move Bill C-10 forward quickly so that it can be passed as soon as possible. Thank you for your attention, Mr. Chair and dear committee members, and we are ready to answer any questions you would like to ask us. Thank you. Thank you very much, sir.
The Canada Media Fund. And by show of hand, I see Ms. Crichton is going to start. Is that correct?
Correct.
Go ahead, ma'am. 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the members of the committee. I'm Valerie Creighton, and as the chair mentioned, Natalie Claremont is also on the line, our VP of Programs and Business Development. So your work on Bill C-10 is absolutely critical. It will shape the rules of the road for broadcasting in Canada, as well as how TV, film, and digital media content is made, who sees it, and whose stories are told. Canada's television and digital media production industry has grown every year for the past 10 years. It creates thousands of jobs from coast to coast to coast, in cities and in towns, 181,000 jobs in 2019 alone. Heartland Film in Southern Alberta generated 4,500 jobs and $460 million in economic activity over 10 seasons. And the content industry attracts investment in Canada by streamers, foreign production companies, and foreign broadcasters. Jusqu'à au déclin, The Decline, a Quebec-led French language feature commissioned by Netflix, has been seen by 21 million people. Our industry showcases Canadian stories and talent to the world, and we are on top of our game in that regard. Radio Canada's C'est comme ça que je t'aime was the first and only television project invited to screen at the 2019 Berlin Film Festival. Digstown, a Black-led Halifax production, was recently purchased by Fox for U.S. distribution. CTV's Transplant recently sold to NBC and was hailed by the New York Times as the best drama on television. And of course, Schitt's Creek won 9 Emmys and recently received 5 Golden Globe nominations. Unprecedented success. And these shows were made in Canada by producers, broadcasters, and the CMF. CMF is the largest screen content fund in the country. We provide approximately $350 million to independent producers and digital media companies annually. Our revenue comes from 2 main sources, 43% from the federal government and 52% in contributions from the broadcast distribution undertakings, the BDUs, in a regulated percentage of revenues only from cable, satellite, and direct-to-home subscriptions. But when the CMF was created 10 years ago, the model was 1/3 government funding, 2/3 BDU. Today, the BDU contributions are declining as Canadians cut their cable cords or don't subscribe at all. And as a result, the CMF's revenue from the BDUs declines every year. In discussions around Bill C-10, it has been said that streamers like Netflix should contribute to the CMF like Canadian broadcasters do. But to be clear, broadcasters do not contribute to the CMF. It's the BDUs like Shaw, Rogers, Bell, and Videotron that contribute, and their broadcast assets are the ones that benefit. For example, this year, Videotron contributed $22.3 million to the CMF. Its broadcast asset, TVA, triggered $25.2 million in CMF funding towards the financing structures of their projects. Every dollar the CMF invests in production leverages $4. And so this is not the time to lose that economic impact or stifle the creative growth of this industry. So how does all of this affect Bill C-10? Well, in our view, in every way possible. We need a modernized legislation, regulation, and a modernized CMF to deliver programs in today's environment. Our system has become archaic. The orderly marketplace is a thing of the past, but the creative and economic potential for Canadian content has never been greater. Bill C-10 is a critical step to unlock change. The CMF supports Bill C-10, but the bill and the CRTC direction requires clear language that prioritizes growth in direct investment in Canadian content production in English and French, Canadian ownership of intellectual property, a platform agnostic approach to domestic and international content distribution, and Indigenous content and content from underrepresented groups as proposed by the Indigenous Screen Office and the Racial Equity Media Collective. It's all this warm weather, I can't talk anymore. We need to bring to this work a mindset of expansion, not contraction, for our stories, our creators, and our industry to leverage the investment to date. And with the right legislative language, we can achieve the phenomenal levels of success available to us in this new future. Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the committee.
Thank you, Ms. Creighton. Now to the Indigenous Screen Office. Is it Mr. Wente or Went? I apologize.
Wente is fine.
Wente is good. Your 5 minutes, sir. Go ahead.
Thank you so much. I am grateful here for the opportunity to speak on behalf of the Indigenous Screen Office and the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit storytellers we serve. As I'm sure you all know, the Indigenous Screen Office was announced by this government in 2017 after years of advocacy for such an agency to exist. We serve First Nations, Inuit, and Métis storytellers within the Canadian screen sector and seek greater opportunity and greater measures of self-determination for our communities within the screen storytelling industry. As a long-sought and only newly created organization, the opening of the Broadcasting and Telecommunications Act presents our first opportunity to advocate for legislative change that could affect our communities and our storytellers. We are pleased to see that our comments are represented within the Bill C-10, the changes in language and the elimination of qualifiers around the need for First Nations, Métis, and Inuit programming and broadcasting to be represented within the Canadian broadcast sector is welcome and long overdue. We believe that the stories of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit are as central to the Canadian story as those of French and English, and as such should be treated the same way within this legislation. As this bill ensures the creation of Canadian broadcasting and the dissemination of Canadian content, it should also ensure support for First Nations, Métis, and Inuit content and broadcast initiatives. We ask that the language within the law be specific. Indigenous is a catch-all term, and while it is one we use to describe the totality of our communities, we feel this law should specifically define Indigenous to mean First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. We also want to ensure that this bill provides the space not just for First Nations, Métis, and Inuit content, but also for broadcast undertakings. This bill should, as much as possible, protect itself from future technological advancements and allow for the possibility of new broadcasting technologies to emerge and for these to be potentially utilized by Indigenous storytellers and broadcasters. In addition to these key points, what I would really like to ask of you today is to consider the true nature of this legislation. Having listened today, I am confident you have heard much about the need to modernize this law to better reflect the broadcasting and telecommunications environment of today. I'm confident that you have heard much about the evolution of broadcasting and transmission technologies and how this legislation must capture that modern state of broadcasting, inclusive of technologies that have emerged since the last time this legislation was amended. I'm confident that you've heard about the importance of onboarding massive foreign media networks into this legislation to better reflect the modes of consumption and creation that Canadian audiences and storytellers are currently engaged in. I'm confident you've heard the need to have these networks meaningfully contribute to our sector here. I'm confident that you've heard about the need for better data collection and aggregation so that our sector may more easily and rapidly adapt to the evolving broadcasting and telecommunications environment. These are all important things, and I know you will be considering all of them. The ISO supports the way this bill approaches the definition of broadcasting and its meaning today. What I would like to leave you with is that as much as this legislation is about all of those things, its central purpose has always been and remains storytelling. And as much as this bill addresses the changes in storytelling, its creation, transmission, and consumption, the true revolution in storytelling is not about technology or broadcast systems or internet-based streaming services. The revolution in storytelling is not about new forms of storytelling or new platforms for storytelling. The revolution in storytelling that this bill must ultimately address is not about the what or the where or the when of storytelling. It's the who. Who is telling the stories we will watch, no matter where or how or when we will watch them? It is the who, because for too long, the who of Canadian storytelling has been too limited, and as a result, the Canadian story and the stories Canadians tell each other have been incomplete to our shared detriment. And these gaps in storytelling have contributed to gaps in policy, gaps in equality, gaps in understanding, and indeed, gaps in humanity. This bill must ensure that the stories that are broadcast, the stories that it is meant to ensure, don't just take place in modern broadcasting and telecommunications regulatory framework, but that these stories come from what has always been the modern Canada, a multinational place with a deep history still largely unexplored, and a rich and diverse future that will be created through right relations between communities and a sharing of our stories. I ask that you pass this bill so that our stories may flourish and so that they may dance together. Miigwech for this opportunity.
Miigwech, and thank you, Mr. Wen. I just want to remind our colleagues again to please direct your questions, or at least say the person you're directing your question to, in order to try to make this as smooth as possible. We want to start with our question round. We're starting with Ms. Ian for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for appearing today. Mr. Wente, want to start with you. You said so much to us, gave us a lot to think about, but where do you see the biggest...
Monsieur le Président.
Mr. Chair, Mr. Reyes, I think the Conservatives were meant to begin the question round, unless the order was changed.
Yes, you are right. I read it the wrong way. Actually, I wrote it down the wrong way. Mr. Reyes, Ms. Ian, I sincerely apologize. Monsieur Reyes, for 6 minutes, please. Sorry, I used to be a chair in another committee. We had different rules. Don't mind me. Just carry on. Monsieur Reyes, 6 minutes, please.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'm sorry, Ms. Ian. I didn't want to be rude to you, but I thought it was our turn to ask questions. First of all, thank you very much to all witnesses for being with us. I will ask questions to the Quebec Filmmakers Association, and I will let all other committee members from different parties to question the other witnesses. But I've had the opportunity to speak with you witnesses at an earlier meeting, and you shared a number of concerns that you had with Bill C-10. I think everyone agrees that we need a bill, and we all want the best bill possible, but there are a number of concerns. You brought up two that you also had brought up during our earlier meeting. You found it very concerning about Canadian creative resources and Quebec creative resources, so Anglophone and Francophone both. And you saw the situation evolve year after year. So I would like to hear you speak to that. And also, can you speak to the situation of French? Last week we heard from the Minister of Official Languages in her reform document that she wants for broadcasting to take into consideration French's decline. But when we read the bill, there's absolutely no mention, it would seem, to protect French language content production. So it seems like the two federal departments didn't communicate. So I'd like to hear your comments on that. Let me know if I properly understood your concerns, and if yes, can you speak further to that? Well, the bill doesn't speak specifically to it, but in the current bill, there is a linguistic mention. What we are looking for is to have recognition and to foster the important place that French should take. So Minister Joly made remarks that we very warmly welcome. And we have the same, or rather, Bill C-10 could be amended in certain ways to tackle that specific concern. What we brought up today is this: the role of foreign companies do not have necessarily a concern for the French language. We're not talking about quotas, but we recommend giving powers to the CRTC to make decisions based on clear objectives that would guide the CRTC in its choices and in the way it would regulate either traditional or digital companies. Thank you for that answer. There should be objectives in place. I think we're all in agreement on that. You also mentioned that if there aren't quotas, it's important for reinvestments made to consider the fact that Canada has 2 official languages. Regarding financing, you said that revenue went down 40%, and that this had an impact on what happened in the field. Can you speak to that? Yes, the OMF's budget and their mandate increased over the years. This is a concern because the only thing that was able to be cut was production, because set prices are increasing year after year. So the only variable they had influence on was production. So yes, that is a concern in our view. We're also worried about the place that independent production is going to have in the new context with these foreign services, which are extremely present in the market. This could have an impact on Canada's official languages. Mr. Pelletier, could you please specify something for the analyst? You said the CRTC intervened in negotiations between broadcasters and producers in the past, but you think that this has been excluded in the new act, and so that would have an adverse impact on producers who are smaller versus bigger. Am I correct in, have I heard you properly? Yes. The act needs to mention the terms of trade. That is to say that the CRTC would be able to regulate negotiations between broadcasters and producers. Because major platforms are asking to have 100% of the intellectual property, so then that property is no longer Canadian. It's important for the CRTC to have the authority to regulate the terms of trade. Thank you very much.
Merci, monsieur.
Thank you to the witness. Thank you, Mr. Reyes.
Confusion at the beginning. Speaking of which, Ms. Ian, it's your turn, and this time I've consulted, and I'm correct. It is your turn right now. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair, and no problem at all, Mr. Reyes. No problem at all, Mr. Reyes. Mr. Wente, just a question for you, and thank you for being here, and to all our witnesses for being here. Want to know specifically what you see as the biggest gap in the bill with regards to Indigenous people.
Thank you so much for the question. I mean, I think the bill is certainly an improvement over the last iteration of this particular piece of legislation, dropping some of the qualifiers. Of course, we'd love it to be stronger, to set measurements. We look to the directive to the CRTC to do those things. Of course, we would also have loved to have seen Indigenous languages entrenched in this bill in the same exact manner that French and English are. But we also recognize the limitations around the current designations around official languages. So I think there's areas we see. The biggest thing that this bill needs to do is to compel the supports for First Nations, Métis, and Inuit content production that it does for French and English. That is really what has been lacking. The previous iteration recognized a need for that content. It just did not provide any supports for that actual production to exist. Now is the time for this sector to actually invest into our storytellers to meet a largely unmet demand internationally for this type of storytelling. And so that's really what we're looking for this bill to do, is compel supports for the production of that content.
Mr. Wente, can you explain the delineation that you're talking about between Indigenous peoples and why that's important?
But we were somewhat surprised to see the word Indigenous actually used in this bill, because as far as I know, it doesn't actually appear in any other law in Canada. And while it is a relatively new term that we use as a catch-all, it does lack a specificity that I think is important if you're going to embed in legislation. And when we're talking about Indigenous content in Canada, that is very specifically means First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, and all of those communities, who are a multitude, have a very different variety and approach to storytelling, rules around or protocols around storytelling. And so we think it's important for this law to be very specific around those communities and not leave itself open to a more broader interpretation that may lead to unintended consequences.
Mr. Wente, thank you so very much. A question now for Ms. Crichton, the Canada Media Fund. Ms. Crichton, you talked about language a lot and clear language and the mindset of expansion, not contraction. Are there specific things that concern you along those lines within this bill?
The issue of expansion versus contraction, and thank you for the question, Ms. Lean, is about money, really. We know right now, as we see and support the sector at the CMF, the BDU revenue is declining for the cable issues and the reduction of cable. Excuse me, that source of revenue to us was stabilized by the federal government in 2017. And eventually that stabilization, the decline in BDU revenue, will outstrip that. There's tremendous pressure on the Canadian broadcasting system, as you've heard, I'm sure, from loss of revenue. This could translate into fewer Canadian stories, lower license fees, or decreased budgets, and that'll make our country's content much less competitive. The industry continues to grow. Demand for content is already a minimum of 50% oversubscribed in this country than resources that are available. There's imperatives to support Indigenous voices. We do have an $8.7 million fund for Indigenous language and content at the CMF, but the demand on that program far outstrips the resources that are there. Excuse me. And at the same time, the dilemma here is that world audiences are clamoring for content. And we've certainly provided some examples of success in terms of stories that have originated in Canada and traveled the world. So as a country, if we want to be present in this world market of storytelling and support our sector to remain competitive, it's going to take some resources. You know, the bill describes the imperative for racialized content and communities that are underrepresented. We were very fortunate through COVID. We were able to support that sector to the tune of about 16 million and provide additional resources to the ISO. And it created just a wellspring of enthusiasm. And we were able to achieve a great deal with that money, but that's temporary and it's only the beginning. The real question now is how do we translate all of that into long-term change, and change that ensures that our media sector represents the fullness of Canada, and more importantly, that those incredible stories are available to audiences around the world. I already forgot the first part of your question, but I focused in on the money. So sorry about that. I hope it answered what you were asking.
It absolutely did. Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. That's it for me.
Okay, thank you very much. Monsieur Champoux pour 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Champoux. You have 6 minutes. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And thank you to our witnesses for being with us today. It's a pleasure to see you again, for those of you who I've already met. I have a question for Mr. Pelletier and Ms. Cyr. My colleague, Mr. Reyes, talked about the decrease in resources. 31F was an important paragraph because it was relatively firm on the obligation for broadcasters to use local Quebec and Canadian resources for production. Could you explain why this relaxing in this amendment could be adverse for the cultural industry in Quebec and Canada?
Madame Cyr.
Oui, bien sûr. Yes, certainly. You heard me earlier quote percentages that were quite important with regard to the reduction in Canadian production versus the production of services that are occupying more and more space. In 31F, indeed, we already call upon the creation resources, and the bill at present doesn't outline that possibility. So for us, it's clear that these objectives with regard to predominantly using Canadian resources would ensure Canadian production, original Canadian production. So for us, it's important that we set aside all of the space for our creators to tell our stories via our creators and for Canadians. In our opinion, it's important, it's even a priority for us to retain that clause. In the context where we have digital players who are extremely powerful and who will have a tremendous impact and influence on the market per se, how did you perceive this redrafting of the clause? And it probably should have been reinforced rather than diminished in its strength. We sense that perhaps there's too much openness or too much flexibility granted in C10 for foreign platforms in particular, because it obligates them to use Canadian talent in the former legislation that we're seeking to review here with this bill. There was an objective, that of using predominantly Canadian talent. So our fear is that by giving too much flexibility to foreign players, they won't call upon our local talent here. And they might perhaps eliminate that portion, and maybe they'll simply limit their intervention to a financial contribution in that area. And what matters to us is to create work for Canadian creators, producers, actors, scriptwriters. That's what we want to see reviewed here. So all of our industry is dependent upon these jobs. Also, the creation portion of intellectual property that will flow from this. The industry overall wants to see this bill passed quickly because we need to refresh the Act. It's been the case for several years now. We're hoping that this will be adopted, but what compromises would you be prepared to make? Or stated differently, what are the absolute conditions for your support for the adoption of this bill? At the outset, we're in favor of the bill. I think we've stated that clearly. We said that at the outset. We have fears. We want the bill to have more teeth. For us, the greatest fear as Francophone creators is that there not be adequate protection precisely for creators with regard to job creation, be they Anglophone or Francophone, but also with regard to original Francophone production. That's our greatest concern. So we want the bill to have more teeth, but we are in favor of the bill. Thank you very much. I have one or two questions for Ms. Creighton, if you may, Ms. Creighton. When we chatted a few weeks ago, we talked about fund sharing for funding televisual production. Right now, it's a third for Francophone productions and 2/3 for Anglophone productions. And you stated that you were close to the idea of reviewing that funding model. Given that Francophone productions are underfunded, it's less costly to produce a half hour in French compared with Anglophone productions. What would be fair, a fair sharing model in your opinion?
Receiving the audio from you.
Are you there now?
Yes, we are. Go ahead.
Yes. Okay. Sorry about that. It was not on the mic. Thank you, Mr. Champeau, for that question. And our conversation earlier was quite interesting. And I want to just start, and then I'm going to turn it over to Natalie Clermont for a little bit more detail.
I'm not sure if we have time for that, ma'am. I apologize.
Okay.
Yeah, but go ahead.
So yes, we are certainly open to it. And what would be fair, I think, is a discussion that we could have once the new program is developed. We know that there's been some discussion to equalize it with the music industry, which would be 40%. Right now, we're confined by the conditions of the contribution agreement, but we're certainly open to discussion because there's great opportunity for French market content all over the world. Language is no longer a barrier, and this provides a huge opportunity for our French market creators.
Merci beaucoup, Madame Creighton.
Thank you very much, Ms. Creighton. Thank you very much. We had so much to say.
We go to the next question, folks. I hope I can get your blessing to extend by not a full 10 minutes, but up to 10 minutes. That's if we want to do a full second round. Seeing a lot of nodding or no, any dissension on that, because otherwise I can't really do a second round without any fairness for all four parties. Okay. Thank you. Madam McPherson for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you. And thank you to all our witnesses for being here today. It's an important conversation as we try very hard to make sure that C10 as legislation is as strong as it possibly can be. I'm going to start. It's lovely to see you, Ms. Creighton, and as somebody who is also in the prairies and also dealing with the deep freeze to the balmy weather. I hope that I also can manage that swift change. You referred to a number of recent shows like Schitt's Creek, which of course we all love, in your remarks as an unprecedented success. In terms of showcasing Canadian stories and talent to the world through shows made in Canada by producers, broadcasters, and the CMF. And I'm wondering what it is in the current system that contributed to that success, and how is Bill C10 responsive to that? Or otherwise put, how can we make sure that Bill C10 builds on what we've done properly, what does this unprecedented success, and that we don't unintentionally hinder that success?
So a couple of things. Schitt's Creek's a really good example, and I am told by the producers of that content, they shopped that idea all over the U.S. and there was absolutely no pickup for it. So CBC came in with the production community. It was developed, got off to a bit of a rocky start, and then by season 2, it was well on its way. And we all know what happened with that. And then, of course, Netflix picked it up, and the distribution in the US made it a phenomenal success with all those rewards. So I think what the Canadian system needs are two things: an increased focus on our IP. I just envision a day where we have enough money at the CMF to support development and production, which would help those content makers retain their rights as they go into the market, and where if there's a Canadian distribution entity, great, and if it's not, at least when they're going out to bargain on their content, they're in a much stronger position. We hear of shows all the time that are developed in the country, They're sold to Netflix. Netflix acquires all the rights. Recent show, Warrior Nun, was the top show on Netflix in 168 countries last summer, and it was developed here by a production company. But unfortunately, that company doesn't participate in the back end of that show or was able to retain the rights because of just the way the system has developed. So two things, IP retention and, of course, the money. If there's more money, we can strengthen our Canadian system, our creators, our writers, our actors, our directors. We can ensure production and development and production gets made in this country. And we know we can take it to the market and be successful.
Ms. McPherson, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. The Monday of COVID. And maybe I'll ask some questions a little bit about the content industry and how it's been affected by COVID-19. There are, obviously encouraging signs in my home province of Alberta as production comes back with health and safety protocols in place. What impacts has COVID-19 had on the production industry, and what does that mean for our consideration of Bill C-10, please?
Well, like every industry, the impacts at the beginning were devastating. And I think everything just ground to a halt. Just at the CMF, we had 1,500 projects that just were shut down immediately. We were very fortunate that with the government's emergency relief program, we distributed $120 million to the industry in just over 10 days. And what that did was it kept the door open, it kept people being employed, and it allowed at least the structure to remain intact. As the government brought in the short-term compensation fund, that guarantee of having a backstop in the event that production had to go down really, I think, enhanced the acceleration of production, content going into production. We've seen it in Alberta. There were some large series like Kim's Convenience and Murdoch Mysteries that were able to start earlier because they had insurance packages previously that covered issues like the pandemic. So yes, you're absolutely right, Ms. McPherson, that production has geared back up. It's slow. We anecdotally know it will be less than last year. And one of the concerns is ensuring we support development so the pipeline keeps moving forward. I think what the pandemic did was just really pinpoint the fragility and the weaknesses in our Canadian system. It started with the digital revolution when the streamers came into the country that accelerated the pressure downwards. And now the COVID has really shone a light on the cracks in the Canadian system. And the bill, I think, will do a great deal to strengthen it and ensure that we can leverage the success of the past.
Thank you very much. And now I don't have very much time left, so maybe on my second round I'll come back to touch on this further. But Mr. Wente, could I ask you a quick question? Do you feel that in the development of Bill C-10, was there adequate consultation with First Nation, Métis, and Inuit peoples?
I think there was some, but it wasn't particularly robust. I mean, we were a relatively new agency at the time, but there has been a lot of, we take our position based on advocacy and research and consultation that has occurred over the last 20 years, and much of the answers have not changed. So our responses were very much a reflection of that. But of course, we approach consultation as an ongoing, everyday sort of activity. And I wouldn't say this process exactly mirrored that, but perhaps that is a little too ambitious. I think more consultation with a wider range of communities is always appreciated.
Thank you, Mr. Wente.
Thank you.
Now, Mr. Aitchison, for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm excited we got to round two because I'm excited to chat with Ms. Creighton again. I had a great visit with her, and Jesse Wente. I'm a huge fan, so I'm a little starstruck right now. Please don't be offended. My first question is actually for Ms. Creighton. I've been reading through the Broadcasting Act, had 20 different meetings now or more, I guess, with different groups, and I've been collating actually all the suggested amendments into the Broadcasting Act NC10 and trying to understand it. And of course, our objective, like so many have said, of course, is to make sure our stories are told and that Canadians can access those stories. And we obviously need to make improvements in terms of which Canadians are telling those stories. We want to make sure all Canadians are. But my fear, of course, is that it's what I'm wondering if what we've done here is with Bill C-10 is to slightly regulate the online streamers while keeping our fairly strict regulations on traditional broadcast media, the BDUs. And I wonder if in fact that's not sort of really the beginning of the end as we transition away from this technology. Is traditional media dead or dying in this country?
Are you asking me? I think.
Yeah.
Yes. No, it's not dead, but it's certainly suffering. And I think the problem is since the advent of the streamers coming into the country, we have had a two-tiered system. There's no question about that, and it's fact that our Canadian system is required to contribute to the making of content. The foreign companies are not, and yes, they're a great source for producers and production to get made. As we've seen vertical integration and the downward pressure on the Canadian broadcast system in particular, there's fewer doors to knock on. And it does become a question of resources and access to markets. So I think it's not dead for sure. And I think storytelling will happen no matter which way this bill goes. I think in order to achieve that balance, you may have to consider both. There may need to be a little bit of flexibility provided to the Canadian broadcast system. We know they need it, but that shouldn't go too far so that, again, the whole system starts to collapse and there's less focus on Canadian content. And there has to be some direction to the streamers, whether it's regulation or some control, so that, as everybody has referenced, the 2.7 billion ends up being one or two shows in the French market and a few in the English market. But the issue, of course, is once the IP is taken by a foreign entity on almost all occasions, that company comes in. They love Canada. They use our great creative talent, our tremendous resources, our locations, but they take the IP and the ownership of that content, and they're the ones who make the money around the world. So that is what has to change.
So can I follow that up with, it's tough to regulate the online streamers, but you can charge them fees. And I'm just spitballing here. What do you think about the idea if we were to impose fees on those streaming giants and reduce the fees on traditional media? They're reducing anyhow, right?
I think, Scott, how you're going to deal with the streamers is the absolute biggest question you've got. And believe me, I'm starstruck with you guys because, you've got the biggest job in the country right now to figure that out. I think fees are an option for sure. I think, whatever technique or mechanism can be brought into the Canadian system to ensure, the streamers are here, that horse has left the barn. They're a great advantage to content because they can distribute it around the world, but the system is a bit out of balance in that regard. So whether you use a system of fees, regulation might be tougher, but not impossible. There's been many examples this morning of other countries around the world. I don't think we have to recreate the wheel here. We can look at to what has been done in Australia, in the UK, in other places, and model it in a similar fashion. Yes, the UK is a bit different because their broadcasters put more resources into content than our Canadian broadcasters do. It's just a difference in the natures of the country. It doesn't really, at the end of the day, matter what you do, as long as you do something. Because the worst case scenario is that the Canadian broadcasters remain under pressure, the streamers do not contribute in any way, shape, or form. That would trigger what you just mentioned, the collapse, certainly, of our industry.
Fair enough. I'll be honest, your final point there is partly my fear. My fear is that we're doing something for the sake of doing something, but not doing as exceptionally as we could, which is why we're doing these. Mr. Wendy.
Mr. Aitchison, I apologize. We're running up against the clock. Mr. Lewis, 5 minutes, please.
I appreciate it. Thank you all for your time and your advocacy. Maybe I would continue with Ms. Creighton. This time is so short these days, and I was going to talk about that as well. You mentioned examples of other countries and that have regulations. Have we been in touch? Are conversations happening with broadcasters across the world or with countries to see if we can work in solidarity up against a very large, platform distributor?
Yeah, we don't do that at the CMF, but I know that our government officials have been in that conversation on a daily basis. It's ongoing. The models are on the table. They're looking at them. We do connect with those organizations on the content front. And I'm going to shut up because I speak too long and it's your show. So I'll be quiet now so that more questions can come.
Oh no, I had planned on you talking and waxing way more on that. So you can certainly expand. The other question I had for you, Ms. Creighton, is you mentioned a platform agnostic approach. So it's overdue that we're working on a broadcasting act, and one of the concerns that people have is, are we doing something that's going to survive the future revenue sources, changing technologies? What in your opinion, what can we do to make sure that we can get on top of this curve and stay there and work to make sure that we don't have to come back and revisit every time technology changes?
Yeah, two things. I mean, you can focus on development and production and enough resources to do so in the country of Canada. We're trying to re-envision the CMF as we speak. We're going out to an industry-wide consultation starting in March to look at, is it possible in this country to have a very strong, what I would call a content fund that ensures that our content gets made in both language markets from the Indigenous community and from racialized communities that have not been served appropriately. If you focus on getting the content made, it won't matter what platform it gets onto because the world will want it. That's the first thing, and I forgot my second point. I'll think about it if I get another chance. Sorry.
I like the way you think. It's very, very out loud. I appreciate it, and I can relate. And if you think about it, let us know, Mr. Wente. That might be a good segue to speak with you. Today and during these meetings, we were very. I'm very proud that we're talking about representing both official languages, about being racially diverse, gender diverse, talking about First Nations, Inuit, Métis. These are conversations that might not have happened in previous iterations of the Broadcast Act. So I appreciate you being here and bringing your voice and this idea to the table. It's nice. No, it's not fast enough and far enough, but we're moving in the right direction, and for that I'm proud. The stories that you talk about the who, that's what you talk about. The stories need to be made. Careers as writers, producers, directors, musicians, actors, journalists, production teams, they often start in very local productions, and so the only way to get these bigger companies is to support them at a local level. So can you highlight some of the importance of supporting local sectors in those early independent days, and maybe perhaps share a success story? It's always nice to have a tangible story of how support can make a difference.
Sure. I mean, I think the ecosystems that we see in the screen sector vary across the country because, of course, there's local supports that may not exist in other places, tax credits, those sorts of things. And I think specifically, certainly for historically marginalized communities, when they're gaining access to a sector, they will begin independently and then grow. And we need that investment now for racialized storytellers in this sector because they historically have lacked that investment. And so what we're seeing now is there's a great demand for content, but we don't necessarily have the infrastructure there to meet that demand. So we do need to have very targeted investment at the local, federal, national, investing in local production companies and local talent to help foster that growth. So I think that is certainly exceedingly important. In terms of a great example, if you just look at what was recently announced at the slate of the Berlinale, the film festival in Berlin, we see two different First Nations productions in there. One, a dystopian sort of sci-fi film by Dennis Goulet, who's a artist based out of Saskatchewan. And then we also see Beans, which is the story by Tracy Deer, which is set at a historical event at the Oka crisis, the conflict at the Ganasatake and Ganawage in the 90s. Two very different films. One is an Indigenous future looking project. One is examining the past through a very personal lens. The Dennis Goulet project is called Night Raiders.
Thank you, Mr. Wente.
That is what the promise of Indigenous content.
Thank you very much, Monsieur Champoux, pour 2 minutes 35 secondes.
Mr. Champoux, you have just over 2 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to come back to Mr. Pelletier and Ms. Cyr. When we met a long time ago, the bill had just been announced, and we talked about the importance of integrating protection mechanisms within the Act for the CRTC to make decisions that would protect French language content and content from Quebec. Do you still believe that if we don't focus on that within the Act, it would give the CRTC a leverage that would weaken French language culture. We always trust the CRTC when it comes to imposing obligations on broadcasters. We believe in our institutions. Of course, we have to give the CRTC the proper means to act. And within our recommendations, we want to preserve the possibility of calling upon the Governor and Council to refer CRTC decisions. We believe in the current system, and it's important of setting objectives that the CRTC will have to respect in the following years. With clear objectives, the CRTC will be able to impose obligations that meet our concerns. A bill such as this one is it's a big project, and we might not have enough time. What do you think about the bloc's idea to make sure that the Act be reviewed, mandatory reviewed every 3 to 5 years, given the fast evolution of the industry, to avoid different forms of injustices within? There is a similar mechanism with copyright. We understand that this is difficult. These mandatory reviews are complex. The world is changing so fast. As we speak, with C10, we're catching up, and there is an urgency to act. This was repeated several times. Thank you, Mr. Petsy. I'm sorry. 2 minutes, 30 seconds for Ms. McPherson.
And I think I'm going to go back to Mr. Wente if I could. This committee's heard from a number of different organizations, including those from the members from the APTN, who spoke about their concerns with Bill C-10. And I also think that Bill C-10 does need to be stronger. So I'm curious if you could just point out what exactly you like about this bill. You know, you spoke of the importance of storytelling and, you know, broadcasting legislation that ensures our stories reflect the diverse stories and voices of our country. How do you think that this bill will ensure that First Nation, Métis, and Inuit stories are heard?
I think the big piece was the dropping of the qualifiers around the need for Indigenous content to be represented within the Canadian broadcast system. As you know, the previous legislation used the phrase, I believe it's when resources become available. And of course, in practice, resources never became available. Or if they did, they became available very recently. You know, most of the Indigenous specific funding is less than a decade old. So I think that's where we take encouragement. We would agree and support both our colleagues at APTN as well as the REMC, as well as the Black Journalists Association in their calls. We think those are very appropriate. But we think the biggest move was to drop those qualifiers, which we think should allow the Governor and Council to direct the CRTC to actually look at ways to enforce the presentation or the production of Indigenous content and the dissemination of it within the screen sector.
And so knowing that those are some of the things you'd like to see, do you think it would be better to have sort of more transparent communication on what the CRTC directive would be, and would it be more valuable if you could get more of that information available?
Yes, of course. More information is always valuable, and we think that those directions need to be very clear, and that the supports are in line with what we see in terms of French and English already. Like I would agree with Valerie, we don't need to reinvent the wheel. What we need to do is to make sure that wheel is actually applicable to all the communities that we're trying to serve within the screen sector.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. McPherson. I have to leave it at that. Folks, thank you to everybody for participating. I want to thank Association des Réalisatrices du Québec, the Canada Media Fund, and Indigenous Screen Office for providing valuable information. And we now will adjourn until Friday, February 26th. Thanks, everyone.
Merci.